morning. Welcome to the Main City Church of God Midweek Bible Study. This week we will be studying Psalms 105 and 106. Let's open with prayer this morning and ask God to be. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to be in your house today, to be able to study your word. We pray for your Holy Spirit to give us understanding to read your word and show in our lives and our Lord. We like to see you. Psalm 105 and 106 is reading from the New King James Version. Here the names and names of the Psalm page 5 and 106 together in the next verse. As we go through this morning, hopefully we'll see that this is the Father's Psalm of the King. So we will see Psalms of the relationships and songs of his faithfulness and power. And the next one says the sad story of the easy story and faith and the Father of God's people. Those 15 verses of Psalm 105 and all such areas and the congregation of praise and the gift of Christ and the history of previous research. We thank for the Lord, all of his name, the name of Jesus of the people. Sing to him, sing songs to him, talk about his wondrous works. Glory in his holy name, let the hearts and ways and doors be put together. These are songs focused on staying in one's soul to bless the Lord. Not better than praise the soul of others to be established to do it. This is the first of several, 50, 30, and 30 that all is working well. These first 6 verses are never found as fully explanation, and they are revelation of spirituality. I will come this morning. This Father has a level of calling upon Yahweh, not upon the hours of the day. He alone deserves to be called upon his name and his life. Therefore, then only these may be. David will recount the amazing things God has done in the sight of all people. It says all the heaven to these things. God teaches the thoughts of all the wondrous works, strengthen them, and in their meditation to the God. All people behold the fullness of faith in his Son. Songs to be sung to them, not to an audience, and those who are the Glory to his holy name. We can glory in many things. Some glory is wealth or status, while others glory is pleasure or entertainment. God's people rightly find their greatest glory in his holy name. Van Gemron suggested 3 goals accomplished with praise in the context of this psalm. Praise magnifies the Lord, contributing power and holiness and glory to his name. Praise intensifies an appreciation of the history of redemption. Praise witnesses to those outside covenant community. Verse 4, forevermore. Remember his marvelous works which he has done, his wonders and his blessings of his name. They see the Abraham and his faith, and clearly his grace to his faith. This faith is given God's people in the future, and follow the way that we found in the Lord and in the power of his might. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. Seek, seek, and seek. We have 3 times here that the word seek is used. The sense is the same. It must be a blessed thing to seek God, for we should not be thus stirred up to do so. If we seek God, then we're looking for him, and we're expecting him to move. Remember his marvelous works which he has done. There is a constant danger that God's people will forget his marvelous works. It dishonors God when we forget his
great works, and we always drift in forgetfulness if we do not actively remember what God has done. Alas, we are far more ready to recollect foolish. If we would keep these in remembrance, our faith would be stronger, our gratitude warmer, our devotion more fervent, and our love more intense. O seed of Abraham, his servant. This psalm is especially directed for God's covenant people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These were his chosen ones in his covenant plan. Abraham is him of closeness, of special appointment. Verse 7 through 12. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the word which he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant which he made with Abraham and his oath with Isaac, and confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as the allotment of your inheritance. When they were few in number, indeed very few, and strangers in it. Before focusing on the works and promises God made unto the people of Israel, David reminds us that God is over all the earth. His covenant focuses on Israel and does not take away from his interest and lordship over the whole earth. He is the Lord our God. He is Jehovah, the self-existent and eternal God. He is our God. He is our portion. And he has taken us for his people and makes us happy in his love. God made a significant covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that was passed to the nation of Israel. It is an everlasting covenant, and Israel's role as God's covenant people remains until the ends of the age. Notice the expression, the word that he commanded, as a parallel term to his covenant. It puts a stress on God's initiative and authority in the covenant making, which means that this bond with men is by grace, not mutual bargaining, and serves the interest of God's kingdom, not the selfish ends of man, but for God's glory. Already in Psalm 105, we have repetition of the word he. The master word in the psalm is the pronoun he. This repetition, it shows that one thought uppermost in the mind of the singer. It is that of perpetual activity of God in all these experiences, through which his people have passed. Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, seems to have paraphrased verse 8 through 11 and recorded in Luke chapter 1, verse 72 through 75. Abimelech, by saying that Sarah and Abimelech, Abraham, a lying prophet of name, were sent in the land, who destroyed all the provisions of who was sold as a slave, till the time that his word came to pass, released him. The ruler of the people let him go, and ruler of all his possessions, was the greater region in the days of Joseph and Genesis, and called the famine. And he destroyed all the provisions of bread. He sent a man before him. David understood that the injustice and misfortune was come upon Joseph was ordained by God. We don't see what we go through sometimes but the end shows what God is really doing in our lives, as he did with Joseph. They hurt his feet with fetters. Joseph's pain in his slavery was real, yet it did not cancel the plan that God had. His session, his affliction, was a time when the word of the Lord tested him. He was laid in iron. His soul came into iron. The iron entered into his soul. The sin entered not into his conscience. See a like phrase in Luke chapter 2, verse 35. They would not yet again turn the sentence around and say that the iron entered into his soul. When we first meet him, Joseph is a tender, yielding lad with dreams of rule, but no conspicuous power. Yet he emerges from this captivity well qualified to take the helm of the whole country of Egypt. The iron fetters were preparing him to wear chains of gold, and making his feet ready to stand on high places. It is even so with all the Lord's affliction ones. They too shall one day step from their prisons to their throne. He made him Lord of his house. Joseph was brought low, but in God's timing he was lifted up. He was given authority over all the possessions of the house and authority over princes and elders. It just goes to show what God can do in your life, even though you don't know where you're going. God knows where he's trying to put you. Verse 23, Israel also came to Egypt, and Jacob dwelled in the land of Ham. He increased his people greatly, and made them stronger than their enemies. He turned their heart to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. After God sent Joseph ahead, he took the people of Israel into the land of Egypt for their own provision and protection as people. Into Egypt, whither he feared to go until God promised his presence and protection in Genesis 46. God said the same in effect to us when to descend into the grave. Fear not to go down. I will go down with you. And be better to me than the fear. He increased his people greatly. In Egypt, God's covenant people multiplied with very little intermarriage with the Egyptians. They stayed separate, basically, from the Egyptians. They were able to grow greatly in Exodus chapter 1. And eventually they became stronger than their enemies. He turned their hearts to hate his people. The people of Israel were welcomed in the land of Egypt in the days of Joseph. But later generations, they were hated and made into slaves for the Egyptians. Exodus chapter 1. God cannot in any sense be the author of sin so far as to be morally inherited in human ungodly men. Destroyed all the firstborn in the land. Terrible death of the firstborn. Every house lost the 41. He also brought silver and gold, and there was none feeble among his tribe. For the fear of them had fallen upon him to give light in the night. The people ate. He opened the rock in the river. Israel came out of Egypt, and the Egyptians gave them great riches. The Egyptians were so crushed by the many plagues that Egypt was glad when they finally left. They thought they couldn't get around long without them, but they were glad that they left and took the plagues with them. Is basically what I believe they thought. There was none feeble. Now, Egypt had lost all their firstborn. The diseased or unable people would not be able to follow what God was leading his people to do. But God, over that vast body of people, every one of them walked out on their own path. God strengthened them. They had been so years they were in slavery. They were beaten. And when it come time to leave, they had the strength to leave. He spread a cloud for cover. As they journeyed through the wilderness, God gave Israel protection in the cloud by day. He also provided fire to give them in the night. These are remarkable emblems of what God is. Israel in the wilderness, providing quail and manna and water that gushed forth from rock. Examples of unbelief. His purpose here is to remember the great works of God, and what God done to move his people. He didn't want to focus on fallen man. He wanted to focus on God. This is stated without one disturbing reference to the sins and without flattering or minimizing in the next psalm, but here the theme is God's wonder. Adam Clark had a curious comment on verse 41, and it said, "He opened the rock." I can now add, in the course of present year, 1892, now lies before me. It is a fine granite, and so well distinguished as the granite, that the feld, spar, the mica, and the fork, of which granite is composed, as God has done. For he remembered his holy promise to Abraham his servant. He brought up his people who enjoy into the land, saying, but so they could observe his statutes and keep his law. The emphasis throughout providence is present. He is true to his word of their responsibility. It is therefore an expression of joyous gratitude. The final verse, but to quote a New Testament equivalent fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh. Praise the Lord. Previous psalm with the Hebrew word, remember.